This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning the show is K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen as he explains 3 developments that have taken place in food and agricultural law so far in 2026. Sarah Ganske, K-State weed specialist, adds to the show as she discusses Marestail and what options growers have for helping control this weed. Part of a Cattle Chat podcast episode from the Beef Cattle Institute concludes today's show as Brad White chats with Abby Heidari about GLP-1 weight loss medications. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you again, Shelby.
Roger, reviewing a recent blog article you shared involving agricultural and food law, specifically just from the first quarter of 2026, and what are the 3 major developments we're going to talk about today?
Well, they're all, I think, related one way or the other to food and food production in the United States. We've got a case going on challenging electronic identification and the EID mandate. That's testing the limits of agency authority. And of course, the Supreme Court, coming up 3 years ago, in the Loper-Bright decision, reversed itself from its Chevron decision. Or actually, this was in 24, so 2 years ago, and said, courts are the ones that should evaluate whether an administrative agency interpreted a statute properly, not the agency itself. So we got that. We've also got commercial speech and the commercial speech doctrine that's involved in terms of states attempting to socially engineer consumer choices through labeling mandates. And that's clashing with the First Amendment. And we've also got the expansion of what I would call extraterritorial state regulations and how that is an attempt by some states to dismantle the unified national market that was intended by the framers to protect states through the Commerce Clause from cannibalizing each other's economic activity. And that's going to Proposition 12 in California, Proposition 3 in Massachusetts, in terms of food production and how the food is produced in other states. So we've got a lot of stuff going on in the courts right now, all one way or the other impacting food production.
And wanting to talk through all of those today, but starting with the electronic identification or EID mandate and what clash is happening between the modernization and the old tag system.
Well, this is in South Dakota. It's a federal case, and the court is presently weighing a motion for summary judgment that cattlemen have raised with the court because previously, last fall, the court issued an order denying the USDA's motion to dismiss the case and allowing the arbitrary and capricious claims that the cattlemen have made to move forward. And so at the heart of this case, Shelby, is the USDA's mandate requiring EID ear tags for cattle and bison moving across state lines. And these ranchers are claiming that the USDA didn't properly exercise its statutory authority under the Administrative Procedure Act, and in fact had exceeded that by replacing what they call a functional low-cost visual tagging system with a $3 per head electronic requirement. And so there's a logic gap that they're arguing is in the USDA rule, and they're pointing out that while the USDA mandates the tags, it doesn't mandate the readers. So it creates a scenario, they're claiming, where ranchers pay for high-tech hardware only to have the data recorded manually, which is the exact process the rule claimed to modernize. So we shall see what happens here, because if the court finds the USDA failed to provide reasoned decision-making or ignored less burdensome alternatives, then the rule could be vacated. And so I think it's a bellwether case for how much deference agencies will receive in this, what we call the post-Loper-Bright era of the last 2 years, where courts are more skeptical of broad agency interpretations.
And what issues then are we also seeing when it comes to labels and what's in Texas, the Make Texas Healthy Again Act?
Well, that act hit a major roadblock just a few weeks ago in February. The District Court for the Western District of Texas, the federal court there, issued a preliminary injunction signaling that the Texas law was likely unconstitutional. And what that law does is require warning labels on products that contain certain ingredients. What they're targeting are additives that are common in plant-based and in synthetic meats. And the court's decision rested on the doctrine of compelled commercial speech. And generally, under that doctrine, the government can force companies to disclose purely factual and uncontroversial information, such as calorie counts. That's a fact. Whatever the calories are, that's a fact. That's not subjective. In the ruling, the court found that Texas was forcing companies to adopt a government-scripted message that wasn't neutral, it wasn't purely factual, by requiring by statute a warning for ingredients approved by the FDA but not recommended by foreign authorities. And the law, the court said, arguably misled consumers rather than informing them. So that act has got some trouble constitutionally. And there are other states that have looked at doing the same thing. So we'll see how that one goes.
And how does that commercial speech impact our producers?
Well, it goes back to the label. What can I put on a label? And that is marketing, that in its essence and its core is marketing of an ag product, which filters back through the marketplace to the farm. And it affects ultimately the price of what is grown on the farm in the marketplace for that item, depending on how it can be labeled or not. So it's a marketing issue that states are trying to address. And here they're trying to distinguish what we would call fake meat from real meat produced from beef cattle, for example, or hogs or chicken or whatever we're talking about. And distinguishing it in the marketplace means you can charge a different price for it. So we're going to have to watch that one pretty closely in terms of ultimately what happens to that law, that Texas law.
Something else you're keeping an eye on happening in Massachusetts, but similar to California's Proposition 12?
Yeah, Proposition 12 has resurfaced in the form of Question 3 in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts law mirrors what California did a few years ago. And of course, the California law went all the way through the U.S. Supreme Court and was upheld. And what Proposition 12 did in California was basically California was saying, hey, look, if you want to sell pork in particular in the state of California, then it's got to be raised in a certain manner that comports with the, put it in air quotes, morals of California citizens. And of course, what's that getting at? What that is getting at is the way that hogs are produced, let's say, primarily in Iowa, number one hog producing state in the country. Because Californians don't like hogs raised in farrowing crates. They want that sow to be able to get up and move around and not touch the sides of the crate. And that requires a lot of retrofitting of hog operations in other states to be able to have their product, the pork products resulting from those hogs, sold in the California market, which is the number one market in the United States in terms of volume. That was ultimately upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. And now Massachusetts has Question 3. And it bars the sale of pork, eggs, or veal in Massachusetts unless the animals were raised with specific space requirements. And so this has again been challenged by the pork producers, and it's a dormant commerce clause case, and it's the idea that states cannot pass laws that unduly burdensome interstate commerce. So we'll see what happens here. It applies to all pork sold in Massachusetts, regardless of whether it was raised in Massachusetts or in Iowa or wherever else. And we'll see whether that is deemed to be discriminatory on its face or not. And so that's we got this moral market issue, again, with respect to a food product that's out there.
Are you seeing that market issue try to make its way into other states as well?
Yeah, there are other states that are paying very close attention to what the courts are going to say with respect to all of these cases, but particularly the last two issues that we talked about. But these are core constitutional questions, and we could really get into the weeds on this if we had time, but we don't. But I would encourage people, let's keep our eye on what happens in Massachusetts, what happens in Texas, what's going to happen. Florida's considering similar legislation to the Texas law. And there's just a lot going on in the courts with respect to ultimately food production. And it has a bearing all the way back down to the farm and even in Kansas. So big issues.
Is there anything producers could be doing?
Other than staying on top of what's happening, just kind of keeping an eye on these things, and then you have to react to whatever the courts say, because then the state legislatures are going to react to it, and then that's what directly affects agricultural production at the farm gate. So stay tuned. I'll keep writing on these things. I'll keep talking to you about them, and other social media aspects too, to get the word out. But these are big issues to keep an eye on.
Roger, for those states that are per se maybe breaking down the United part of the United States commerce system, is there ever a time they're going to just work themselves out of the system?
That's a good question. I think there are a number of us that wonder about that. This is particularly when we talk about the California Proposition 12 or this Question 3 in Massachusetts. And what we get is what's known as the balkanization of the national economy. One state attacking another state's, in this instance, agricultural production, and then that state reacting back against the first state. You kind of get into a shooting match as to who can do the most harm. And the framers of the country designed the Commerce Clause specifically to prevent a patchwork of conflicting state regs that would stifle the national economy. And that's again why these cases are so important to watch, to see what happens, because at its core, that's what's involved, and that's why it's very important to stop this activity and stop the states from basically eating each other up. And in the skinny farm bill that's being proposed, there is a provision that in there that is designed to prevent the states from doing this type of conduct.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link his blog article in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing Marestail and soybeans with K-State wheat specialist Sarah Ganske. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Shelby.
Just as a reminder, Sarah, as we get into talking about Marestail, what is it?
So Marestail is a winter annual weed that typically comes up either kind of fall or spring. And it can be a big problem in some situations, in part because it has these fluffy little seeds that can fly around and go very long distances. And in part because it's just hard to control once it bolts, once you kind of actually notice it. Because it starts in the fall and early spring. Like right now, they're rosettes on the ground. So just kind of a little pile of leaves on the ground. Once it bolts, it becomes challenging to control with most herbicides. Plus, it has a resistance to glyphosate and some of the other herbicides that we have historically relied on.
And you wrote an update article on this, and within it, it says that 80% of Marestail can die over the winter. However, with our per se unique winter we've had this past year, did we see that kill off?
Yeah, so that data actually came from a study out of Indiana that is a few years old. So yeah, a mild winter like this, those winter annuals, if they're protected at all by residue on the ground or what have you, they have a higher chance of survival when we don't have long cold periods. But the other thing I would say is that anecdotally, it seems like more of the Marestail that we're seeing is potentially fall emerging Marestail. Like we're seeing a little bit of a shift towards more fall emerging Marestail.
Any guesses as to why that is?
Differences in management practices, potentially, as we think about maybe, it seems like maybe for a while folks weren't using quite as many fall herbicide applications. I think in general, we're seeing less Marestail as a whole. And so that's probably part of it. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. And again, that's purely like anecdotal, right? We've kind of gotten off the train of science here. That's anecdotal. So,
and going back to the train of science, any early spring options?
Yeah, so there are options early in the spring. I alluded to this before the weed bolts. So when it's still a rosette, that's the best time to spray for it. So early spring burn downs are a great time to catch horseweed or mare's tail. And now apparently, Shelby, the new WSSA or Weed Science Society of America approved common name is Canada fleabane. So this plant now has 3 names in my dictionary, so it's exciting. But yeah, there's lots of options for this time of year. This time of year, 2,4-D or dicamba is probably kind of the easy button there. For that, something that is a little potentially more expensive and a newer product though is Elevore. So that active ingredient is haloxyphin. It is also a group 4 plant growth regulating herbicide like 2,4-D and dicamba. So those are going to do a nice job of controlling rosettes that have already emerged. And again, now is the right time to be thinking about that. Other things to think about that might help hold and prevent additional emergence would be things like Valor, so products that contain flumioxazin, or I've been talking about metribuzin a lot this winter, but metribuzin is so Sencor, products like that is also an option to help prevent emergence of additional flushes of mare's tail horseweed going into the spring.
How fast does a mare's tail go from that rosette stage to bolting?
Well, as we get into the warmer temperatures of like April, it's going to happen pretty quickly, Shelby. That's a good question. Like as far as like you go 1 week and you come back the next, yes, it's probably going to have gone at some point. It will have gone from a rosette to being bolted. And then once it hits, like once those internodes really start to elongate, it'll get pretty tall pretty quickly, right? Like it can go from that tiny little rosette to something that's like 5 feet tall.
As we are thinking about controlling this, is there anything that growers should be keeping in mind as they're thinking about getting that next crop put in the field?
Yeah, so thinking about pre-plant, right? We tend to struggle with mare's tail historically more in soybeans than other crops. I would say that, as mare's tail bolts, 2,4-D and dicamba become less effective. But again, early season, especially ahead of enlist or extend flex soybeans, 2,4-D and dicamba are an option right up to planting. Another product that we're talking about more and more here lately is Liberty or products that contain glufosinate. We don't necessarily think of glufosinate as a great product for, these kind of smaller leaf area types of plants that have lots of hairs on the leaves and stems. And so it's kind of hard to get good uptake, but glufosinate can be effective when it's applied in the right conditions. So early spring is not necessarily the right conditions. But anecdotally, one recommendation that we can think about here is to include sharpen or herbicides that contain saplufenicil with your glufosinate. Those applications tend to work better on larger mare's tail than even say like just a 2,4-D dicamba application by itself.
Does the mare's tail ever get so tall that you're just going to have to deal with it, that there is no killing it off?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, once it bolts, once it gets over about 6 inches tall, it's like a lot of weeds. It really becomes a challenge to control with herbicides. And again, anecdotally, talk to folks that Sharpen Liberty type of combo, they say will take down, foot tall or higher mare's tail. So it can be effective on large plants.
As we're thinking about taking care of mare's tail, do we need to also maybe keep in mind to make sure our soybeans can handle the herbicides that we might be using?
Yeah, so we kind of alluded to this when we were talking about some of the pre-plant options as far as 2,4-D and dicamba, Shelby. And so just making sure that you know the genetics, the traits, the herbicide resistance traits of the varieties that you're planting is really important. So, Enlist can only be applied on Enlist soybeans, and Extend Flex soybeans can be treated with Striax is the new name for Extendiflex, and then there's Ingenia and Tavium on the marketplace as well. So yeah, just making sure you've got your products matched up with your trait package is continuing to be an important, and I would say it's an increasingly important thing to keep in mind as we get more and more complex trait packages.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske. I will link her e-update article on Marestail in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Penn State University Extension's Jamie Kopko as they discuss how to monitor and control mosquito populations.
When it comes to control of mosquito populations, whether it is a municipal entity or a private homeowner, Penn State University Extension's Jamie Kopko explains,
we simply do not have the technology to completely wipe out mosquitoes. What they accomplish is a reduction. It's not an elimination of mosquitoes.
So what might mosquito control look like in light of warmer days ahead? And in turn, the return of mosquito populations. Kopko says municipalities take what he calls a systematic approach.
Typically, they'll have sort of set sampling points kind of all around the territory that they're in charge of taking care of, where they might have light traps up to collect adult mosquitoes. They might be sampling water bodies to check for mosquito larvae. In some cases, for monitoring for mosquito-borne diseases, they'll have what are called sentinel chickens. It's basically little chicken coops, and they'll periodically do blood draws from the chickens and check for West Nile virus and other mosquito-borne diseases. And they do this just routine, continuous surveillance.
Many public and private pest control entities have working knowledge of areas. For instance, how many mosquitoes in a trap within a set period of time triggers a spray treatment to reduce populations.
But even with all of that systematic monitoring, they're also very responsive. If they get a bunch of calls from people in a neighborhood saying, hey, we're getting overwhelmed with mosquito bites, you got to do something about this, then typically they will investigate the matter further and, if needed, go out and do a spray.
Mosquito control in one's yard can vary. Some choose professional pest controllers. Some may apply chemicals on their own or through a professional. And some may use integrated pest management methods. Although Kopko advises,
integrated pest management does include chemical methods. So using chemicals does not mean you're not using integrated pest management.
That also doesn't mean there isn't all natural mosquito traps available, whether commercially or homemade. Kopko provides one example.
Basically, you're just like a bucket of water and you throw some grass clippings or leaf litter in it and it creates this really appealing egg-laying site for them. And it's got like a one-way door in it. So the female mosquitoes can get in hoping that they're going to lay eggs and then they can never get back out. So if that's the kind of mosquito you have, then you can use a completely non-chemical approach that the technology is a bucket with a fancy lid, and you can significantly reduce your mosquito pressure that way.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White and special guest Abby Heidari.
We're going to jump into these GLP-1s, and I'm going to start out with why are these getting so much attention right now, and what are some of the key aspects that we should know about those GLP-1s?
So I would say in general, the reason people are talking about them right now is because we're seeing more of the medications being used than that we have before. Currently, about 12% of the U.S. population reports that they're taking a GLP-1 receptor agonist medication. And there is a range of those medications. And we're going to see a lot more of those types of medications coming out that have different aspects to them in the next, 2 to 5 years, probably. In addition, there was a recent Omada health survey of primary care physicians that found that 30% of those physicians reported patients were asking for the medications. And then compared to other weight loss approaches, not including things like bariatric surgery still has the highest outcomes in comparison to patients that are just following diet and exercise alone. We see individuals that are using these medications, they actually are having a little over twice the percentage of body weight loss after 1 year compared to an individual who is just trying to lose weight with diet and exercise alone. So I think because of all of these things, physicians are prescribing the medications more of the medications are coming out, and more people are talking about them.
How do they work?
Medications work in several different ways. An oversimplified explanation of GLP-1s is that they're a class of medications that are going to mimic a hormone that our body naturally produces. And then that helps regulate appetite and blood sugar. GLP-1 stands for glucagon-like peptide 1. So glucagon-like peptide 1 is the hormone that it is mimicking. And then because of that, it works to slowly allow an individual to not have food leaving their stomach as quickly. So because food actually kind of sits in their stomach a little longer, it allows more signaling to happen to the brain, telling the brain that I am full. So these medications typically help to reduce what most people are describing, or what you see on a lot of social channels as far as the word food noise. They don't feel hungry as often. They don't think about food as frequently. And that's something that physiologically is constantly happening to individuals that have the disease state of obesity. They constantly have this food noise versus an individual who doesn't have a disease state of obesity. They don't have that. It's not something that is just always on their mind. So then as a result of an individual not having that in their mind all the time, they tend to eat smaller portions. They're not feeling as hungry, so they eat smaller portions. And then that, of course, ends up leading to weight loss.
Are we losing just fat, or is there some muscle loss that occurs with this as well? And what are the implications there?
So this is going to be a concern with rapid weight loss in any instance, whether an individual is doing it through diet and exercise or if they were on a medication. But when somebody experiences rapid weight loss, they can lose lean muscle along with their body fat. So that is why your healthcare professional team is going to often really focus on emphasizing, I would say, 2 things, and that's staying physically active, especially doing that weight-bearing exercises. So, exercises where you're putting weight on your body, whether it is walking or running or doing actual weightlifting. Non-weight bearing would be things like biking or swimming, which are amazing, wonderful activities, but they're not weight bearing as much. So that physical activity is going to help maintain muscle while you're losing that body fat, but then also getting enough protein in your diet. For an individual who is losing weight rapidly, we want to maintain that lean muscle mass. And so that leads to needing adequate protein in order to support that muscle and to be able to not lose any additional muscle while you're losing the body fat. Because if you do lose a lot of muscle, then that messes with your metabolic health, and that's not good for the long run.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.